Horrific. It was a stinker of an afternoon in Dunolly, Victoria. The air was heavy, shimmering with heat. A dry, baking heat mixed with a faint, hot breeze off the almond groves that made sweat trickle down the temples of anyone walking the dusty tracks between the paddocks. This town was usually quiet. Kids rode their bikes on gravel roads. Mums hung washing on hills hoists, and the screech of galas echoed from the gums. But on the 15th of January, 2023, at around 11:45 a.m., that peace was shattered into something unimaginable. In the middle of the sprawling almond farm, belonging to a well-respected local, Margaret Maggie Henderson, stood an old corrugated iron shed. The shed was usually used by the seasonal pickers for smoko and storing gear. Its roof was rusted, the tin walls were starting to warp, and the door was always jammed halfway open, as if inviting anyone in. From a distance, a foul, cloying smell had been drifting on the air that afternoon. At first, folks put it down to a dead roo or a fox caught in a trap. Understandable, the heat often brought with it the stench of decay. But the smell got stronger, and more people started covering their noses. It wasn't just rot, it was thick, chemical, and caught in the back of your throat. A stomach-turning mix that seemed to carry a message of death. Keithy Donaldson, a 50-year-old chook farmer, was walking slowly along the fence line bordering the grove. He was searching for a few of his hens that hadn't returned to the coop that morning. His usual friendly whistle was replaced by a low grumble, as his eyes scanned the dry scrub. As his steps brought him closer to the old shed, the unnatural smell hit him full force. He paused, his heart giving a sudden lurch. Probably just a dead fox, he muttered, but a sick curiosity pulled him forward. The shed door was open just a crack, enough for a thin sliver of light to cut the darkness inside. With a trembling hand, Keithy pushed the squealing tin door. In that instant, his body froze. His eyes widened, his breath hitched. Inside the shed, dozens of human bodies lay still. Some were on their backs, faces pressed to the concrete floor. Some were curled up stiffly, as if still trying to breathe. One had his hands clawing at the tin wall, as if searching for an escape. Their faces were a sickening blue-grey, eyes staring, with dried foam crusting their lips. Blowflies buzzed, their drone a horrific sound. Keithy staggered back, his legs barely holding him. A choked whisper escaped his lips. Jesus, Mary and Joseph. They are all gone. His voice cracked the afternoon quiet. He stumbled out, hands shaking as he covered his face. His shout brought a few workers, who were pruning trees in the next paddock, running over. Within minutes, the area around the shed was swarming. Pale faces, screams, and wails filled the air. A woman collapsed when she saw, through the gap in the door, her husband's body lying rigid inside. Kids ran away, grabbing their mothers and crying. The usually peaceful town was thrown into chaos. People called the local police. Some ran to the main road, flagging down help. Soon, blue and red lights flashed down the long dirt drive. Police tape was stretched, forming a yellow perimeter around the shed. Officers blocked anyone from getting closer. But the stench that continued to pour from the shed told everyone that something truly horrific had happened inside. Some locals whispered. They figured the workers had food poisoning, maybe a dodgy takeaway, or chemicals from the farm spray. But when the local paramedics arrived and took one look at the state of the bodies, they knew this was no simple accident. The foaming mouths, the rigid, convulsing limbs, the look of terror frozen on their faces, it all pointed to something far more sinister. Maggie Henderson, the owner of the farm, arrived in a plume of dust. She was in her late 60s, known for her generosity. She often donated to the CWA, was a stalwart at the local church bake sales, and always had a kind word. But that afternoon, as soon as she saw the scene inside the shed, she collapsed onto the dry earth. Her cries were raw, and she beat her chest. "Oh God, why? Why has this happened?" Her anguish made many others break down in tears. Everyone knew her as a good, kind woman. Nobody could believe a tragedy this immense could happen on her property. But amidst the chaos, the tears, and the prayers, stood one policeman with a deeply furrowed brow. His name was Detective Senior Sergeant Dave McGrath, a senior investigator from the Bendigo CIU, with over 20 years of handling the tough cases. He knew something was off. He watched Maggie Henderson as she wailed. But through her shrieks, McGrath sensed something performative. The sobs were loud, but not a single tear fell. Every so often, she would dart a quick glance at the police officers taking notes, as if gauging their reaction. Detective McGrath looked down and made a short note in his small notebook. Emotion insincere. Worth watching. That night, the police began identifying the victims. Most were seasonal workers, drifters from other parts of the country. Some from Queensland, some from New South Wales, even a few from WA. They'd come for the harvest season, staying in the basic accommodation. But as the checklist of workers was counted, a shocking fact emerged. There were 26 names on the roster, but only 25 bodies in the shed. Who was the missing person? The question made the tense atmosphere even heavier. Police moved fast, and the answer was found quickly. The person not in the shed was Liam Jenkins, a young worker from Queensland. But he wasn't missing. He was lying in a bed at the small Dunolly Hospital, just 2 kilometres from the scene. According to the medical records, earlier that morning, before the tragedy, Liam had suffered a severe allergic reaction. He'd been stung by a bee near the woodpile. His body was covered in hives, he couldn't breathe, and his mates had rushed him to the hospital. Because of that, he wasn't there for the communal lunch with his friends. No one could have guessed that his small misfortune would be the one thing that saved his life. When he was told that all his mates were dead, Liam became hysterical. "No. That's not possible. We were just mucking around this morning. Why them? Why not me?" His voice broke, sending a chill through everyone who heard it. Detective McGrath immediately realized Liam wasn't just a survivor. He was the key witness. His memory might hold the first clue to unlocking this mystery. But behind it all, a larger, terrifying question hung in the air. If this was murder, who would be capable of wiping out 25 lives at once? And if there was a killer, then Liam, the only one left alive, could very well be their next target. The corrugated iron shed stood in the middle of the almond grove, just a few dozen meters from the rows of trees, their leaves thick and green. From the outside, it looked ordinary. But once the door was fully open, the image from inside would be impossible to erase. In the cramped, stifling 4 by 5 meter space, 25 bodies lay stiffly. The concrete floor, usually covered with dusty sleeping mats, was now their final resting place. One body lay face up, eyes staring at the unlined tin roof. Another was curled up, as if still fighting the pain in their chest. Another was positioned as if they'd been running, hand clawing at the tin wall, desperately seeking a way out. Their mouths were crusted with dried foam, their skin a blue-blackish color. Around their noses and lips were the dried remnants of fluid. Several bodies were still leaning against each other, showing just how quickly death had come. There were no overturned chairs, no signs of a struggle. Just an suffocating, awful silence. Green blowflies swarmed in every corner, their continuous drone a symphony of death. The stench intensified, making anyone who got close want to gag. A mother who caught a glimpse of her son's face inside the shed let out a blood-curdling scream and fainted. Neighbors tried to carry her away while others covered their mouths with their shirts. The usually quiet town was in turmoil. People yelled out the names of their family members. Some cried while reciting prayers. Others stood frozen, unable to process the reality. An old man sat on the ground, pounding his chest, repeating the name of his grandson, who had been working on the farm. News of the mass death spread like wildfire. Within a short time, dozens of locals had gathered. The small dirt track to the grove was choked with utes and cars. Some tried to push past the police tape, but officers held them back, their voices firm. "Don't go in. It's not safe." The crowd could only stand behind the line, staring at the shed that was now the center of the town's universe. Soon, more patrol cars arrived. Officers brought more yellow tape, securing a wider perimeter. A forensics officer, face covered by a mask, stepped inside. He was only in there for a few minutes before coming back out, his face pale. The symptoms were obvious, this wasn't an accident. Foaming mouths, rigid limbs, faces contorted in fear. All signs pointed to a highly dangerous poison. Screams and prayers mixed in the hot air. The women of the town clung to each other. Some wept loudly, others could only manage quiet, shuddering sobs. Children ran away, frightened, but their small eyes kept looking back, as if needing to confirm the nightmare was real. In the middle of it all, Keithy Donaldson, the man who found them, was still shaking. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. He told the police how he'd just been looking for his chooks, how the god-awful smell led him to the shed, how he saw the bodies piled inside. As he spoke, his voice broke several times, his eyes glazing over. Night fell, but the tension didn't ease. Portable floodlights were set up around the shed to help the investigation. The yellow tape glowed in their harsh light, separating the world of the living from the frozen horror inside. Detective Senior Sergeant Dave McGrath stood near the shed door. His face was tense, his eyes sharp, observing every detail. In his small notebook, he wrote down things that might seem trivial. The position of a pot on the camp stove. A bowl of vegetables on the table. A frying pan with leftover grease. He knew that in cases like this, the truth was often hidden in the smallest details. But the image of the victims was hard to shake. McGrath took several deep breaths, trying to steady himself. He'd been a detective for a long time, but seeing death on this scale still rattled him. 25 lives, gone. No fight, no noise, just a creeping, devastating silence. Outside the shed, locals started setting up their own lights. Some sat cross-legged on the ground, reciting prayers in low voices. Others just covered their faces with their hands. The town, usually filled with the sound of crickets, was now filled with weeping and prayers. Meanwhile, at the Dunley Hospital, Liam Jenkins was still lying weakly. He had no idea that while his body was fighting an allergic reaction, his life was being saved. When the news reached him that all his friends in the shed were gone, Liam screamed and broke down. His words were fractured, his voice raw. He couldn't believe it. He was joking with them just that morning. Now, he was the only one left. McGrath had already heard about Liam. He knew that behind that weak, allergy-ridden young man was the key to this whole thing. He immediately decided that Liam needed to be under guard. Not just because he was fragile, but because he could be the next target. Back at the shed, the night grew darker, but the stench didn't fade. It only seemed to get more pungent. Forensic officers were busy, zipping the bodies into black bags, one by one. The crowd watching from a distance covered their faces. Some sobbed, some just looked down. In a corner of the yard, a small boy named Finn, about 12 years old, stood watching. His face was pale, but his eyes were sharp. He clutched a worn-out school notebook. This local kid often helped the pickers carry small loads for a few bucks. That night, he just stood there silently, committing something to memory. something that would later prove to be vital. The atmosphere grew heavier as the first ambulance arrived to transport the bodies to the morgue in Bendigo. One by one, the black bags were loaded. Hysterical screams broke out again as family members tried to get closer. Several had to be held back. The town had officially transformed from a peaceful outpost to the silent witness of a massive tragedy. McGrath stood near the ambulance as the back door closed. He stared into the distance, his mind racing. Who could do this? How did the poison get into their food? And why did it all happen on a farm that was known as a place of kindness and good fortune? As a low fog began to settle, the town of Dunolly seemed to hold its breath. There was no more laughter, no sound of farm bikes. Just the prayers rising with the hot, dry air, begging for the truth to finally come out. Morning in Dunolly usually started with the sound of magpies warbling from the high branches. Kids got up, mums made toast, and the men prepared to head out to the paddocks. But the morning after the tragedy, the atmosphere was different. The dirt roads were still packed with the footprints of the crowd from the night before. The heavy air still carried the faint, lingering smell of death. People whispered, their faces anxious. The laughter was gone. At the Dunolly Bakery, the usual spot for the old-timers' morning coffee, the conversation revolved around only one topic: 25 people dead, all at once, in the shed at Maggie's farm. Some said it was bad food. Others were convinced it was some kind of curse. But a few dared to whisper that it must have been deliberate. A small crowd was still gathered at the gate of Maggie Henderson's property. The old woman sat on a wicker chair on her veranda, her face pale. Her cardigan was buttoned wrong. Her hands fumbled with a rosary, her fingers trembling. She would occasionally bow her head, letting out a low, pitiful moan. The locals watched her with mixed feelings. For decades, she'd been a pillar of the community, always giving to charity, always at the CWA meetings. It was hard to believe such a horrific event could happen on her land. Police cars and forensic vans had been coming and going since the night before. The small country lane, usually only used by tractors and utes, was now full of official vehicles. For the townsfolk, the sight only added to the fear. They'd never seen this many coppers in Dunolly. Detective McGrath stood in front of the shed, wearing his dark vest. His face was grim, his eyes scanning the police tape. He knew the rumors were spreading. Food poisoning. A gas leak. But his years of experience told him not to trust the easy explanations. The evening before, he'd seen the bodies himself. The symptoms were clear, this wasn't just off milk. Foaming mouths, rigid limbs, blue faces. Those were the signs of a powerful, fast-acting poison, not a bad curry. McGrath noted every detail. For him, every tiny piece mattered. The forensics team was busy photographing and taking samples. The large pot that had held the rice was still there. A bowl of vegetable curry, and a pan used to fry some meat were all bagged as evidence. The lid of the rice pot, slightly askew, was lifted carefully. Everything was sealed, everything tagged. McGrath gave a simple order. Get all the leftover rice. Every last grain. If there was a poison, it was probably in the rice. The locals watching from a distance whispered among themselves. Was it really the food? What if there's still poison around? Some parents refused to let their children play outside. The town was gripped by a quiet dread. In the midst of the chaos, a scrawny kid named Finn stood just outside the tape. He clutched his worn-out notebook. The boy, who everyone knew was being raised by his gran, was used to helping the workers for a few dollars. The morning before the tragedy, he'd been hanging around the farm. He'd been too scared to speak up last night, but his eyes held something. McGrath noticed Finn. He knew kids often saw things that adults missed. But he didn't approach him yet. Everything had to be done carefully. At the hospital in Bendigo, the autopsies began. Grieving families waited in sterile corridors, their faces etched with sorrow. They'd come from all over, Queensland, New South Wales, WA, all brought together by the same bitter fate. Meanwhile, at the Dunley Hospital, Liam Jenkins was still lying in bed. He was alive only because of a bee sting, but the survivor's guilt was crushing him more than any physical pain. The friends he'd shared a beer with the night before were all gone. His tears flowed silently. His quiet sobs made the nurses lower their eyes. McGrath came to see him. He sat by the bed, his voice gentle. "I know this is hard, Liam. But what you remember from that morning could help a lot of people. Your memory. It's all your mates have got now." Liam was quiet, wiping his face. He tried to remember. They'd had breakfast. Just toast and instant coffee. He'd gone out to the woodpile. Then the sting. His skin felt like it was on fire, his throat closed up. He'd stumbled back, wheezing, and his mates had carried him to their old ute to get him to the hospital. But before they left, he remembered one thing. The sound of the big pot lid being lifted. A quiet tick. At first, he thought it was just the tin shed cooling, but he'd seen a shadow pass the kitchen window, wearing a dark, wide-brimmed hat, like an akubra. He couldn't see the face, but they moved fast. McGrath wrote it down. That was a vital detail. He knew that if someone had entered the empty kitchen, the poison didn't get there by itself. A human hand had put it there. As the investigation continued, the rumors got wilder. Some said it was black magic. Others accused the workers of bringing bad luck from their hometowns. But for McGrath, the truth could only be found in the facts. He didn't believe in curses. What was real was the leftover rice, the pot, and the one witness who was still breathing. In the corner of the yard, Maggie Henderson was still sitting, looking frail. She moaned softly, "Those kids. They were like family." But her eyes occasionally darted towards the police. McGrath made another note. Emotion insincere. Needs further attention. Night fell, and Dunley was still gripped by fear. People gathered at the local church, lighting candles. Among the prayers, one question hung in the air: if this wasn't an accident, who would be evil enough to poison the rice? That afternoon, the sun was sinking low. The shadows of the gum trees stretched long across the dry grass. The area around Maggie Henderson's farm was still buzzing. After the discovery of the bodies, locals were gathered 3 deep behind the police tape. The sound of weeping mixed with prayers. Every so often, a new shriek would tear through the air as another family member recognized a loved one among the bodies being moved. In the midst of this, an old Holden Commodore pulled up. A woman got out, wearing a rumpled floral dress. Her steps were unsteady, her face pale, her eyes red. It was Maggie Henderson, the owner of the farm, known to everyone as a community stalwart. The locals who saw her whispered. Some said, "Poor bugger." Others just looked down. For decades, Maggie had been a part of the town's fabric. She'd give you the shirt off her back, always front and center at the CWA meetings, always helped with the school fete. How could this happen on her property? As she got closer to the shed, Maggie suddenly collapsed. She pounded the dry dirt with her fists, her voice cracking. "Oh God, my boys. Why has this happened?" Her wail was raw, and it made many of the tough-looking farmers nearby wipe their eyes. A few local women rushed over, trying to help her up. But amidst the wailing, Detective McGrath watched her intently. He stood nearby, mentally recording every detail. Maggie's sobs were loud, they echoed, but her eyes were dry. Not a single tear. Every so often, she'd peek through her fingers at the police. Her glances were quick, but sharp, as if checking their reactions. McGrath took a long, slow breath. He noted it down: crocodile tears. All performance. To anyone else, it was the grief of a broken woman. But to a seasoned investigator, the mismatch between the sound and the lack of tears was a red flag. Night began to fall, and portable floodlights were switched on, bathing the scene in a harsh glare. The forensics team was busy, photographing, measuring, and collecting evidence. The stench of death still hung heavy, mixed with the smell of dry eucalyptus. The locals remained, watching from behind the tape. Some were still looking at Maggie, who was now sitting on a wicker chair, her face buried in her hands. McGrath approached her slowly. He spoke softly, trying to keep his tone neutral. I know this is a terrible time. But there are a few things we need to ask. Who usually holds the key to the food storage shed? The question made Maggie pause. She swallowed, then answered, her voice trembling. I do. Just me. No one else. McGrath jotted it down. The answer was simple, but it raised more questions. If only Maggie had the key, how did the poison get into the supplies? He didn't press further that night. He knew the right time would come. Elsewhere, the scene was chaotic. Family members screamed as the bodies were zipped into black bags. A young woman fainted when she saw her husband's face. A small child cried for his dad. Neighbors tried to comfort them, but the grief was too big. Maggie still sat on the chair, holding her head. Every so often, she'd let out a low moan. But for McGrath, the longer he watched, the stronger his suspicion grew. The tears that never came, the quick glances at the police, and the admission that she alone held the key. It was all adding up. That night, the town was shrouded in grief. People gathered in the small church, praying together. Kids were held close. Stories spread fast. Food poisoning. A curse. But some were starting to whisper, this was deliberate. In the small, makeshift command post, McGrath wrote his initial report. He underlined 3 things. 1. 25 victims, all with the same symptoms, all died fast. 2. The leftover food, especially the rice, had to be the priority for the lab. 3. Maggie Henderson's emotional state needed to be closely monitored. He closed his notebook and looked towards the shed, still cordoned off. The truth won't hide for long, he thought. Fake tears might work for a while, but the facts will speak louder. The night in Dunolly dragged on. The few streetlights flickered. The sound of crickets seemed hesitant. But around the Almond Farm shed, it was still busy. Police, ambos, and locals remained. The body bags had been taken to the morgue, but the yellow tape remained, glowing under the floodlights. McGrath sat at a makeshift desk in the command post. Reports were coming in. He read the list of harvest workers carefully. 26 names on the roster. 25 bodies. His brow furrowed. 1 person missing. Who? He immediately ordered his team to cross-check the names with the families. It wasn't long before an officer came back. Boss, the name not accounted for is Liam Jenkins, a young bloke from Queensland. But he's not missing. He's at the Dunolly Hospital. Checked in this morning with a severe allergic reaction. McGrath stood up immediately. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. 1 person out of 26 survives, and he just happens to be away from the farm when it all went down. This was his key. He hurried to the hospital, flanked by 2 officers. In a small, sterile room, Liam lay weakly on a hospital bed. His skin was still red and blotchy from the reaction. His breathing was labored. A nurse sat beside him, patiently helping him sip some water. When she saw the police, she moved aside. McGrath approached, his steps quiet. He sat by the bed and looked at Liam's pale face. His voice was gentle. "Liam, I know this is a terrible time. Your mates. They are gone. But what you remember from this morning could help us find the truth. Your memory is all they've got left." Liam's eyes filled with tears. His voice was broken. "It's not possible, mate. We were just mucking around this morning. They were all fine. Why them? Why not me?" His sobs were heartbreaking. McGrath put a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. After Liam calmed down a little, he started to talk. That morning, they'd had some toast. He'd gone to the woodpile. Got stung by a bee. Within minutes, his chest was tight, his skin on fire. His mates panicked and bundled him into their old ute to race him to the hospital. That's why he wasn't there for the big communal lunch. McGrath noted it all. Then he asked quietly, "Before you left, did you see anything in the kitchen area?" Liam wiped his face, trying to remember. I heard the lid of the big rice pot tick. Quiet, like. I thought it was just the shed cooling. But then I saw a shadow pass the kitchen window. Someone wearing a dark, wide-brimmed hat. Couldn't see who. After that, I was really struggling to breathe, and the boys carried me out. McGrath looked at Liam. That was the detail. The tick of the pot lid and the shadow in the hat. It meant someone had approached the kitchen while it was empty. Someone who might have put something in the rice. To ensure his safety, McGrath immediately ordered a constable to stand guard outside Liam's room. He knew that if this was murder, Liam could be the next target, because he was the only one left who could talk. Meanwhile, news about Liam spread through the town. One of them survived. Some called him lucky. Others said he was protected by God. But for McGrath, this wasn't about luck, it was about facts. And the facts were now tied to a weak young man, fighting his own survivor's guilt. It was late, but the command post was still active. McGrath wrote in his notebook, 25 dead. 1 alive. The one alive didn't eat the lunch. Heard pot lid. Saw shadow in hat. The pieces were starting to form a picture. But he knew the road ahead was long. Who had access to the kitchen? Who held the key to the food store? Who knew the kitchen would be empty at that exact time? It all had to be investigated. And McGrath knew every step could be dangerous, because the killer would not want the truth to come out. Outside the hospital, the night air was dry. The street lights cast a weak glow. McGrath stood for a moment, looking up at the dark sky. He thought, as long as Liam is breathing, there's hope of finding the truth. But he also knew that protecting Liam's life was the same as protecting the last door to the answer. Morning at the Dunolly Hospital was slow. The air was still heavy from the oppressive heat of the day before. From behind the frosted glass, the sun tried to break through, but a thin layer of smoke haze from a distant fire muted it. In a simple room, Liam Jenkins lay weakly. His allergic rash was fading, but his face was pale, his eyes empty. A uniformed constable sat on a chair in the hallway, right outside the door. He'd been given direct orders by McGrath: no one gets in without clearance. This witness is too important, McGrath had said. If anything happened to Liam, the mystery of the 25 dead could be buried forever. McGrath entered the room quietly. He carried his worn notebook. Sitting beside the bed, he looked at Liam with empathy. His voice was calm. "Liam, I don't want to push you, but your memory is crucial. Try and tell me again, slowly, what you saw and heard that morning, before you left for the hospital. Liam took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he wiped his face. His voice was barely a whisper. We had breakfast. Just toast. I felt sick. The bee sting. My mates were panicking. They said I had to get to the hospital. He paused, swallowing. Sarah. One of the other pickers. She said she was going into town, to the IGA, to get some soy sauce and sugar. She left around 9 a.m. So the kitchen was empty. I was just lying on my mat, feeling dizzy. That's when I heard the tick. The pot lid. Quiet. McGrath leaned in, his eyes serious. The pot lid. Are you sure it wasn't just the shed groaning in the heat? Liam shook his head slowly. At first, I thought so. But a few seconds later, I saw a shadow pass the kitchen window. Someone wearing a dark, wide-brimmed hat. Moved fast. I couldn't see who. My eyes were already blurring. Then the boys carried me to the ute. McGrath wrote quickly. Kitchen empty for approx 20 minutes. Sarah went to IGA. That's when the sound and the shadow appeared. The facts were hardening his suspicion. The poison didn't get there by itself. A human hand put it there. Meanwhile, back at the main farmhouse, Maggie Henderson sat on her veranda, looking frail. A few neighbors were with her. Her eyes were red, her face pale. She'd occasionally moan about how the workers were like her own kids. But McGrath, who had just arrived, wasn't swayed. He asked, his voice flat, I need the key to the main food storage shed. Who has had access to it? Maggie swallowed, her voice trembling. Just me, detective. No one else. Why are you asking about keys? McGrath stared at her. Because, the key determines who could have accessed the food supplies unsupervised. The question hung in the hot, still air. The neighbors looked at each other, confused. But McGrath didn't elaborate. He just made a note and stood up. It was becoming clear, the path to the truth lay with the people who had access to the kitchen and the storeroom. On the edge of the property, a scrawny kid named Finn was watching. The 12-year-old clutched his worn notebook. He approached a young constable and whispered, Mate. Earlier this morning. Before all this, I saw a white ute parked near the big shed. A tall bloke in sunnies got out. Looked like Mr. Darren. The young constable immediately reported it to McGrath. McGrath nodded slowly. His mind immediately connected it to the name that had been bothering him, Darren Henderson, Maggie's only son. The young man had only shown up after the tragedy, looking calm, collected, and claiming he'd been in Melbourne all day. But to McGrath, something too neat, too tidy, was always suspicious. That night, the command post was busier than ever. The forensics team arrived with their kits. They photographed, tagged, and collected the leftover food. The pot of rice, still holding a few grains, was handled with double gloves and sealed. The curry pan and bowls were also secured. They would all be sent to the lab in Melbourne. McGrath was clear, check all the rice. Every last bit. If there's poison, it's in the rice. Why the rice? Because everyone would have eaten it. If the poison was odorless and colorless, they'd never have known. Outside, the locals were still gathered. Some prayed, others just whispered, their faces full of fear. The town, usually so peaceful, was now trapped in a fog of mystery. People were becoming afraid to eat together. They worried the tragedy could repeat itself. At the hospital, Liam was still lying in bed. Tears fell silently, as he remembered the faces of his friends, smiling just that morning. He felt guilty for surviving. But he also knew he was the only one who could tell their story. McGrath stood at the window of the command post, staring into the hot, dark night. He whispered to himself, "This truth is fragile. But as long as Liam is alive, it still has a voice." He also knew the shadow in the wide-brimmed hat wouldn't just give up. As long as the witness was alive, the danger was real. Night fell slowly over Dunolly. A thin haze hung between the gum trees, as if trying to cover the fresh wound. But for Detective McGrath, tonight was not for sleeping. He sat in the command post, lit by a single fluorescent light and surrounded by files. His mind kept replaying Liam's words, the tick of the pot, the shadow in the hat. The pieces were still scattered. In the middle of his thoughts, a young constable brought in a scrawny kid. His clothes were rumpled, and he clutched a worn-out school notebook. It was Finn, the local kid who hung around the farm. The constable whispered, "Boss, the kid says he saw something the morning before it happened." McGrath looked at Finn and managed a small, tired smile to calm him. He knew a kid this age would be terrified. He crouched down to be at the boy's level and asked gently, "Finn, what did you see?" Finn swallowed, his voice small. I saw a white ute parked near the big storage shed. A tall bloke in sunnies got out. Just for a minute." The ute. It had a sticker on the back window. "One of them Denny Ute Muster ones." He paused. "After that, I saw him walk fast towards the kitchen." McGrath stood up straight. He knew exactly who that description matched. In a town this small, there was only one white Holden ute with a faded Dennis sticker. It belonged to Darren Henderson, Maggie's son. McGrath looked at Finn again. "Are you sure, mate?" The boy nodded, clutching his notebook tighter. "I'm scared, mister. But I saw him." McGrath wrote it down. White ute. Dennis sticker. Tall bloke in sunnies. Shadow in the hat. It was all pointing to the same person. But he didn't want to jump the gun. Suspicion wasn't enough. He needed hard evidence. He looked at Finn with respect. "Thanks, mate. You're a brave kid." Not everyone's brave enough to speak up. After Finn's gran picked him up, the post was quiet again. McGrath looked at a rough map of the farm. He marked the storeroom, the kitchen shed, and the spot where the ute could have parked. The distance wasn't far. Easy for someone to grab something and get to the kitchen before anyone noticed. At the farmhouse, Maggie Henderson was still on the veranda. Darren Henderson had finally shown up, dressed in a clean business shirt, hair neat, face calm. He claimed he'd been in Melbourne all day, with receipts from a cafe to prove it. But for McGrath, something so perfectly prepared was a red flag. A normal person would be confused, distraught. Darren was just calm. McGrath didn't confront him directly. He knew he had to play this carefully. One wrong move, and the suspect would lawyer up, or the evidence would disappear. He just watched from a distance, noting every move. Darren spoke briefly to a few locals, then sat with his mother. His face was blank, as if unmoved by the massacre that had just happened on his family's property. At the hospital, Liam was still in his bed. He'd heard a rumor that a kid had seen a white ute. Tears welled up again. He spoke quietly to the constable guarding his door. "That morning, I really did hear the pot lid. If someone really went in, it must have been when I was too sick to move. My mates, they didn't know anything. They just ate." The constable noted it and reported back to McGrath. The pieces were fitting together. An empty kitchen. The tick of a pot. A shadow in a hat. A white ute with a Dennis sticker. It was all forming a tight, ugly picture. But McGrath knew witness testimony wasn't enough. He needed physical proof. That night, he ordered his team to do another sweep of the storeroom and the area around the house. In a corner, behind some bags of feed, they found a small, plastic bag containing purple granules. Police sealed it immediately. McGrath stared at the bag. He knew that color. It was a high-powered, dangerous pesticide. The night was getting late, but McGrath's eyes were sharp. He looked at the evidence bag, then closed his notebook. The truth was starting to take shape. Dawn was just breaking over Dunolly. Dew clung to the sparse grass. But at the Henderson farm, the scene was anything but peaceful. The police tape was still up, and the lingering smell of death still clung to the air. McGrath was there early, a travel mug of black coffee in one hand, his notebook in the other. For him, this case was a puzzle, and he was fitting the pieces. Soon, a white van from the Victoria Police Forensic Services Department pulled up. Officers in white coveralls got out, carrying cases. They headed straight for the kitchen and the shed, collecting samples of the rice, the curry, and any traces of vomit left on the floor. Everything was carefully bagged, labeled, and numbered. McGrath watched closely. He knew the biggest answers were in those samples. He gave an instruction: the rice is the priority. Everyone ate the rice. That's how the poison got in. No one survives that. Unless they don't eat. Meanwhile, the townsfolk were still gathering. They stood behind the tape, whispering, their faces anxious. Some still clung to the food poisoning theory. Others were talking about curses. A few had started to say, this was murder. But no one said it loudly. At the farmhouse, Maggie Henderson sat on her veranda, looking frail. McGrath approached her, his face unreadable. We found some purple granules in your storage shed. Do you know what they are? Maggie swallowed, her eyes darting around. I don't know. The shed. It's just for rice and supplies. Maybe the workers left it. McGrath's gaze was level. That shed was locked. You told me you have the only key. The workers couldn't have gotten in without you knowing. His voice was flat, but the accusation was clear. Maggie looked down, wringing her hands. She said nothing. At the hospital, Liam Jenkins was sitting up in bed, still under guard. Every time he thought of his friends, the tears came. But when the police asked him again, his voice was stronger. I'm sure I heard someone in the kitchen. I heard the pot lid. I saw the shadow in the hat. This testimony was recorded. Now there were two witnesses, Liam, who heard the act, and Finn, who saw the white ute with the Dennis sticker near the storeroom. Both accounts were tightening the circle of suspicion. That evening, the call from the lab in Melbourne finally came. The voice on the other end was professional and grim. Detective, the samples from the rice, the curry, and the victim's stomach contents all show extremely high levels of carbofuran. It's identical. It's a pesticide. Odorless, colorless when dissolved. Their blood enzyme activity was almost zero. Consistent with acute, massive poisoning. McGrath hung up the phone and stood at the window for a long time. His hands were clenched. All the pieces now formed a terrible picture. The poison was added after the rice was cooked. That meant someone deliberately opened the pot, poured in the poison, and closed it again. He immediately called his team. Secure that shed again. I want every spoon, every dishcloth, every tea towel. And dust the entire kitchen. Door handles, pot lid, window. I want prints. Outside, the locals were still gathered. The news that it was poison in the rice was starting to leak. People gasped. Some cried again. Who could do this? But McGrath wasn't thinking about who in the abstract. He was thinking about the facts. The poison was confirmed. The kitchen was empty for 20 minutes. There was a shadow in a hat. There was a white ute with a Dennis sticker. All lines were now pointing to one family. But he knew the path ahead was still dangerous. He had to get a confession. And he had to keep his witness alive. Because as long as Liam was breathing, the truth had a voice. Night fell quickly over Dunolly. The few street lights did little to pierce the darkness. At the Dunolly Hospital, the atmosphere was more tense than usual. A uniformed constable sat on a chair outside Liam Jenkins' room, his eyes alert. He knew this wasn't just a witness, it was a target. Inside, Liam was sitting up in bed. He was still weak, but his mind was clear. He kept seeing the faces of his friends. Sometimes he'd just cry silently, whispering, "Why not me?" Around 9 p.m., the usually quiet hallway echoed with soft footsteps. A woman in a nurse's uniform appeared, carrying a small tray with a syringe. Her face was partially hidden by a surgical mask. She walked quickly, purposefully. The constable stood up. "Where are you going?" The woman's voice was muffled. "Sedative. Patient is agitated." The constable frowned. "Let me see the doctor's order." The woman suddenly looked nervous. Her eyes darted left and right. Her hand, holding the tray, started to shake. The constable stepped in front of her. "The order. I need to see the order." The woman swallowed, then, in a sudden movement, she turned and ran back down the hall. The constable lunged, but she was fast, disappearing around a corner. She left behind a small vial that had fallen from her tray. It rolled to a stop by the wall. The constable, wearing gloves, picked it up. The label was clear, diazepam. A powerful sedative. He immediately radioed it in. "Boss, we have a situation." An intruder, female, disguised as a nurse, tried to access the witness with a sedative. McGrath arrived minutes later, his face grim. He stared at the small vial, now in an evidence bag. His voice was low and angry. "Someone's trying to shut Liam up. They'll try to make it look like an overdose, or an accident. But they want him silent." Liam, who had heard the commotion, was trembling. "Mate. Don't let them kill me. I remember. I remember the hat. I can still tell you." Tears streamed down his face. McGrath sat by his bed, putting a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, Liam. We've got you. Whatever you remember, you tell us. But right now, your only job is to stay safe. The truth needs you." Liam nodded, his lips trembling. "I'll talk. I remember the sound of the spoon hitting the side of the pot. Quiet, but I heard it." McGrath recorded the new detail, then gave sharp orders. "We are moving him. Tonight. To a safe house. No one outside the core team knows the location. We change his food delivery. We take his name off the hospital records. No more gaps." Meanwhile, outside the hospital, locals at the pub had heard rumors of a commotion. The whispers grew. Was it a real nurse? Was it a hired killer? The town's fear deepened. Back at the farm, Maggie Henderson sat on her veranda, with her son, Darren, standing beside her. He was talking quietly, his face still unnervingly calm. He kept looking down the road, as if expecting someone. McGrath, watching from an unmarked car, made another note. Too calm. Too prepared. Unnatural. Before heading back to the station, McGrath stood for a moment in the hospital car park. He looked up at the dark, starry sky. Every step we take, he thought, we get closer to the truth. But the closer we get, the more shadows will try to stop us. The sky over Dunolly was a dull grey. The rain from the night before had left small puddles on the dirt roads. Most locals stayed indoors, the fear still hanging thick in the air. At the command post, McGrath looked grim. The attempted infiltration at the hospital was a clear sign. Someone was desperate to silence Liam Jenkins. And if they were that desperate, it meant the investigation was getting close. McGrath opened his notes. The name that kept coming up was Sarah. She was the other worker, the one who had left the kitchen empty when she went to the IGA. She was called back to the post. She arrived looking pale, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, twisting a piece of tissue in her hands. McGrath kept his voice gentle. Sarah, just run me through that morning one more time. Her voice trembled. I went to the IGA around 9 a.m. Had to get soy sauce and sugar. I got a lift, bought the stuff, and was back by 9:20. When I got back, the rice was on the stove. The guys were waiting for lunch. McGrath looked at her sharply. Who knew you were going to the IGA? Sarah paused. All the workers knew. And I mentioned it to Maggie before I left, just to see if she needed anything from town. So, not just the workers, but the owner knew the kitchen would be empty. McGrath made a note. Thanks, Sarah. You can go. But don't leave town. Just as she left, an officer rushed in. Boss, the white ute. Darren Henderson's. It was just seen heading back to the farm. McGrath closed his notebook. Right. Time to talk to him. A few minutes later, Darren was standing on the veranda, looking polished as ever. Clean shirt, good jeans, calm face. He even managed a small, tight smile when he saw McGrath. McGrath got straight to the point. Mr. Henderson, I need to borrow your phone. We need to verify your location on the day of the incident. You said you were in Melbourne all day. Darren's smile stiffened. Oh? Sorry, detective. Left it at home. His face was calm, but his foot started tapping. McGrath's voice was low. Left it at home? Or deliberately switched it off? Darren gave a short, humorless laugh. Detective, this is getting a bit ridiculous. I'm just a local bloke. I don't know what you're getting at. McGrath didn't react. Mr. Henderson, we'll be requesting your phone's location data from the provider. If you were in Melbourne all day, the data will clear you. If you weren't, the data will talk. Darren's jaw tightened, but he tried to deflect. I just want my mother's name cleared. Just find out who did this. McGrath watched him. The slight tremor in his leg, the hands clenching at his sides, the smile that never reached his eyes. All the classic signs. But suspicion wasn't proof. He instructed his team, get the phone tower data for Darren's mobile. Check the town's CCTV for that white ute. And put a guard on Finn's house. That kid saw more than he should have. That night, the initial lab report came back. The voice on the phone was clear. Boss, the rice is full of carbofuran. It's a pesticide. The symptoms match: foaming at the mouth, convulsions, rapid respiratory failure. McGrath hung up, his face hard. The pieces were locking into place. The poison. The empty kitchen. The tick of the pot. The shadow in the hat. The white ute with the dentist sticker. It was all circling one family. But he also knew that the closer he got, the more dangerous the pushback would be. And he had a feeling the shadows were closing in. The sky over Dunolly was heavy. At the Bendigo police station, the atmosphere was electric. McGrath stood in the middle of the office, staring at a computer screen. The tech team had just received the official data from the phone company. Darren Henderson's phone records. A tech analyst read from the screen, "Boss, the mobile signal pinged off the tower nearest the Henderson farm between 9:10 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. on the morning of the incident. After that, the signal disappears, like the phone was switched off. It only reappears in the Melbourne CBD grid at 1:35 p.m. The room went quiet. McGrath closed his eyes for a second. Darren's alibi, that he was in Melbourne all day, was completely blown. The digital footprint didn't lie. Another officer chimed in. "Boss, we got a photo from a local's dashcam. 9:22 a.m. Darren's white ute, dentist sticker and all, turning off the main highway towards the farm." McGrath noted it down. The phone data, the dashcam photo, and Finn's eyewitness account. They all corroborated each other. The shadow in the hat that Liam saw. It was all pointing one way. But he needed the full chain. The poison, the access, the window of opportunity, and the person. That afternoon, the full lab report arrived. The samples from the rice, curry, and victim autopsies all show massive traces of carbofuran. We also found residue on the inside of the pot lid, and on a stainless steel soup ladle found in the kitchen. The conclusion was clinical: the poison was stirred into the rice after it was cooked. McGrath's jaw tightened. Stirred in. He checked his notes. 9 a.m., Sarah leaves for the IGA. 9:10 to 9:30 a.m., Darren's phone is at the farm. During that window, Liam hears the tick of the pot lid. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were a complete, horrifying picture. He looked at his team. Liam Jenkins. I want him under 24/7 guard. Move him again if you have to. If someone's tried to silence him once, they'll try again. We are this close. He knew the pushback would be fierce. The Hendersons were a respected local family. But the evidence was piling up: gambling debts, pressure from a loan shark, and now, a digital and physical trail leading right to their door. That evening, he brought Darren Henderson into the station. The young man arrived with his lawyer, still looking composed, still in a clean shirt. McGrath laid it out. Mr. Henderson, your phone's location data puts you at the farm between 9:10 and 9:30 that morning. This is in direct conflict with your statement that you were in Melbourne all day. Darren's mask of calm finally cracked. Just for a second. He stammered, I might have stopped by to drop something off. But I never went near the kitchen. I don't know anything about any poison. McGrath's gaze was unrelenting. What did you drop off, Mr. Henderson? And who did you drop it off for? Darren fell silent. His fingers drummed on the table, an uneven, nervous rhythm. His lawyer tried to interject, but McGrath just waited, the silence in the room more powerful than any words. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky a sickening orange. McGrath didn't believe in curses. He believed in facts. And that night, the facts had a face. The morning in Dunolly was still, the air thick. At the local police station, McGrath was staring at a convoy. Two unmarked cars. In the back of the first, Liam Jenkins sat, pale and nervous. The night before, the fake nurse incident had proven the hospital wasn't safe. They were moving him to a secure safe house. McGrath put a hand on his shoulder before the door closed. "Stay strong, Liam. We've got you. Just remember, you're a voice for all your mates." Liam nodded, clutching a small Bible a nurse had given him. The two cars pulled out slowly. The first car held Liam and two armed officers. The second car, a standard patrol vehicle, followed behind. The country roads were quiet, lined with dry grass. As they rounded a sharp bend near a dry creek bed, two men on a dirt bike suddenly appeared from the scrub. The bike was old, its number plate caked in mud. It followed them for a click, then accelerated, pulling up alongside the first car. The driver, a seasoned officer, immediately saw the threat. The pillion passenger fumbled in his jacket. Not for a gun, but for a small glass bottle. He threw it onto the road, directly in front of the car. The bottle smashed, and a foul, acrid smell filled the air. A homemade chemical bomb, designed to make the driver panic and crash. The driver swerved, but held the car steady, yelling gas vents, as he hit the button to recirculate the air. From the car behind, the patrol officers saw the attack. They hit the siren. Two officers leaned out the window, firing warning shots into the air. The loud crack echoed across the paddocks. The sound panicked the bike rider. He hit a patch of loose gravel. The bike fishtailed, and both men were thrown into a dusty ditch. One scrambled up and made a run for the trees, but was tackled by an officer. The other, clutching a broken arm, was arrested by the creek bed. In their pockets, they found a knife, masks, and a brown envelope full of cash. Tucked inside the envelope was a scrawled note, "Shut him up. Or else." A mobile number was written on the back. News of the attack reached McGrath. His face hardened. "Hold them. Get the call logs from that number. Now?" At the station, the two thugs, their bravado gone, didn't last long. The number on the note. It had made 3 calls that morning to a well-known local loan shark. The same loan shark who, according to whispers, had Darren Henderson in his pocket for thousands. McGrath sat in his office, looking at the evidence board. The chain was complete. Darren, drowning in gambling debts. Maggie, the protective mother, holding the keys. The poison from the shed. The mass murder too. What? An insurance payout. Wipe out witnesses to another crime. And when the one survivor, Liam, threatened to talk, they sent in the thugs to silence him. In town, word of the attack spread. People were terrified. This wasn't just a tragedy anymore. This was a conspiracy. At the local pub, the whispers were loud. Who would do it? All those lives. For money. Meanwhile, Liam was safe in a new location, guarded by 3 officers. That night, he prayed for a long time. He knew his life was still on the line. But he also knew the truth was the only thing that could save him. McGrath stood on the veranda of the safe house, looking into the dark. This wasn't just a murder case anymore. It had struck at the heart of this small town's sense of safety. He made a promise to himself. He wouldn't stop until every last one of them was behind bars. That afternoon, the sky over Dunolly was a pale, washed-out orange. The sun was setting, casting long shadows from the gum trees. But on Maggie Henderson's farm, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The police tape was still up, and the forensics team was back, this time on a new mission, to find the last pieces of the puzzle. McGrath led the search himself. He knew from experience that the truth was often hidden in the most obvious places. Every shelf, every container, every piece of cloth was examined. In the food storage shed, an officer found a small, clear plastic bag tucked behind a stack of rice sacks. It was filled with small, purple granules. McGrath moved in, his eyes hard. He knew that color. It was the pesticide. The exact same poison found in the lab results. The bag was sealed, photographed, and tagged as evidence. Not far away, in the kitchen shed, the team re-examined a small stainless steel ladle. A rapid field test showed a positive reaction for carbofuran residue on the handle. More shocking, a dirty tea towel hanging on a hook also tested positive. It was as if someone had wiped their hands, or the ladle, after mixing the poison. But the most damning piece of evidence came from the main farmhouse. In the mudroom, hanging on a hook, was a simple floral print scarf. When tested, the fibers at the end of the scarf showed traces of the same poison. McGrath looked at it for a long time. He recognized that scarf. He'd seen it in photos, seen Maggie Henderson wearing it. Several of the other workers even confirmed it was hers. McGrath took a deep breath. The circle was now closed. The poison was in the rice, on the ladle, on the tea towel, and on the scarf of the farm's owner. All the evidence was